This is a wonderful, wonderful way to learn about art and the migration series and to learn how to make those connections with your students. And they invited me in part to give sort of more background knowledge, I guess on BBK Plus for the migration series. And I think it sort of mirrors their process at the charter school pretty well. Rachel said that after the first type of exploratory or expeditionary learning that they did, they then explored or they answered some of the students' questions. So I think that's what I'll try to do, to have with you a nice contrast between the exploratory learning style that we had before and like good old-fashioned behind the PowerPoint showing images, answering questions. So first of all, I'm from the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C., and I'm manager of teacher programs. So I work primarily with teachers in schools and partnership programs. The migration series is sort of our core work for K-12 education. We've found over the years that it is an ideal way to engage students with art and other subject areas. So we've had dozens and dozens of programs based on the series. As Chris mentioned earlier, the Phillips Collections owns half of the migration series. The other half is owned by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. We have the odd-numbered panels of the 60. They have the even-numbered ones. So we each have a good sweep of the narrative. We don't have the whole story, but we have enough that we can tell it with great effectiveness. The museum itself, have any of you been to the Phillips collection before? Oh, good, handful. How many of you have seen the migration series in person? A few more. How many of you use the migration series in your classrooms? Okay, gives me a good sense of it. So, just as a primer, when Lawrence created the migration series, he was doing it after having done individual series on Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Toussaint Louverture, the liberator of Haiti. So he focused on historical series of African American heroes that he found were left out of mainstream textbooks and could serve as inspirational role models, primarily to the African American community. And then he switched gears. He conceived of the idea of creating a series about the Great Migration because, in a certain sense, it was his story. His mother's family was from Virginia. His father's family was from South Carolina. He was born during the Great Migration in 1917 as his family was coming north. So the series was conceived of basically as cause and effect. So cause and effect would be the horrors of life in the South and then what the migrants found when they went north. There's also panels scattered throughout that feature the railroad and transportation and coming north. So you get the sense of kind of a call and response narrative of how life in the South brought the migrants north. So it's a very good model for working with students. Each panel has a caption. And what I thought we would do is kind of a modified VTS exercise. When Lawrence wrote the captions, they present a great contrast with the visual image. And it allows students, and anyone for that matter, whoa, this is moving all by itself. Look at that. We don't need all that. Let's see if it sticks right here for a while. So the caption reads, during World War I, there was a great migration north by Southern African Americans. And what I would want to ask you all is, what information do you get from the words that Lawrence used, and what information do you get from the visual language of panel number 1? How, for example, can you see movement in this image?
I know I saw the triangles, but I studied this in college where he did that purposely, so it looks like they're leaning and constantly moving. with that triangle shape, and it's kind of like bent over, so it's that motion.
Yeah, so the amount of diagonals in here just gives you a sense of motion. Very simply, with school groups at the museum, we'll have the kids lie on the floor to show horizontal lines, ask them about movement, stand up straight, and then stand on a diagonal. Okay?
I think the trellis's work is sort of a directional element.
Can you say more about that?
I don't know, I think that it reminds me a little bit of tracks in the sense that there might be a railroad allusion back to the trellises. And they're pointing up, so I'm thinking they're in the south and they want to go on top of the trellis.
So it sort of reinforces the diagonals that the people are positioned in, and it points upward. Yeah?
I see that it's very crowded and almost all, everyone wants to go. That's the feeling it gives.
Okay. What gives you the feeling that everyone wants to go?
All the children, the men with top hats, the women, it looks like they just all want to go north. Doesn't matter where, St. Louis, New York, or Chicago, they're just trying to get up there.
Okay. A community on the move. Okay. Others? Yeah.
The fact that the entire bottom and the right-hand side is filled with people, and they're almost like, I mean, the way he did it, they look like they're staffed because they're going further deeper. If you were to move the camera, you would continue, I feel like I would continue to see a crowd of people trying to get into Chicago or New York or St. Louis.
And I love that observation that you have a sense of cropping here, and the idea of a camera, a sweep of people. One of Lawrence's influences was thought to be motion pictures. He was very interested in movies, and one of his friends in the late 30s and early 40s was the first film curator for the Museum of Modern Art. And that person was very influential in sharing the sort of cinematic art with Lawrence, and it's thought to be incorporated in the painting. Others? Yeah.
I feel like when I look at this image, I see it seems to me the sound is off, but if I were to turn the sound on, that I guess kind of goes back to what you were saying with the motion picture, but it would be a very loud, clamoring, lots of voices talking over each other, sound that goes along with this.
It seems like more people want to go to Chicago.
Okay. And what makes you, that's a total BTS question. What makes you
Because their bodies are mostly facing Chicago and New York. And I guess if you could do movement right away, then you could have faced left and you could have faced right to St. Louis, but it seems like there's just a small amount of people that are going towards St. Louis and everyone else is trying to crowd towards Chicago and New York.
That's an amazing connection. I think you know the math exercise as well, but the idea that they go straight up into Chicago, New York, and to get to St. Louis, they have to go on more of a diagonal. That's cool. Yeah.
I'd like to piggyback on that because I'd like to know if that observation is regional. Coming from St. Louis and living in the Great Migration Path and having seen this all now, how many people from the coasts assume that Chicago and New York are the destinations as opposed to St. Louis? Because that's kind of a constant regional thing that those of us between the mountain ranges notice. Kind of the flyover zone. But it wasn't a flyover zone. And I wonder how much of that is the background knowledge or background perspective as people are
All the way in the back in the art. That's you.
I'm just switching over a little bit. So I noticed that the whole foreground is saturated in color. And underneath Chicago, New York, and St. Louis, it's white. And so that makes me, I guess to me that shows like hope or a promise of something and we don't know what. But then in the foreground too, there's something that's white. I don't know if it's a baby. There's something like way on the left. Is that a baby? So that just makes me wonder why that's white.
So it makes you wonder about sort of the symbolism behind the whiteness, what it could mean. Okay?
I'm just wondering if they knew where they were going. I mean, there are those three choices. I mean, that we can see, and did they really know where they were, you know, which one was gonna be the better choice? I think right at that point too, they really didn't know, you know, not only did they choose to leave the south, but now which city up north do you go to?
So it might be a way of suggesting that they have choices. They're all kind of unknowns perhaps, but they don't know yet.
They're all moving forward, and it doesn't seem as if there's an opportunity to turn around and go in a new direction. It's all pointed in caution.
So because they're all pointing in the same direction, it gives a sense of momentum, energy, kind of the group. Yeah.
I think going back to the way that the white is up at the top, it draws your eye up and it creates that movement going back towards those doorways. And then also the baby in the white and the children are all dressed in like bright yellow or bright red. And I think that represents that the migration was hoping for change for the children, a better life.
I also saw the white in behind Chicago, behind New York, behind St. Louis as traveling into the unknown. So they know what they're leaving, but they don't necessarily know if they're going to this big blank canvas. And I also didn't, whenever I look at this, going back to the crossed idea of the picture, I didn't assume that St. Louis, New York, and Chicago were the only choices. I assumed those were the only choices we saw, but if you kept going in the direction, you might see like Denver or Philadelphia or any of the other cities that anybody might have gone to.
Even Boston.
Or even Boston, yes. So I just assumed that it was this long line of cities, and the forward motion of the people was, well, so I'm skipping St. Louis, I'm skipping New York, I'm skipping Chicago. Where is there a shorter line maybe?
I'm noticing that as there is this vast mass of people, it's a very narrow opening into the gates that they have to squeeze through. And in my interpretation of that is that the whole book implies now the city is too narrow.
One interesting thing to consider with that is the different way Lawrence uses lines. So what do you notice about the line, the doorway, as opposed to the other?
That should be vertical.
Mm-hmm.
That should be vertical.
Yeah, so horizontal and vertical. So they're less likely to move. There's a sense of stability. I'm sorry? Yeah, they're all right angles. What do you think that means, the effect of having all right angles?
Well, maybe it's like, when we look at the triangles of the people, those are thinking to do that kind of stuff. That's right. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have an interpretation for that. Yeah.
Well, I noticed that you see the images of the people out the door, but then you don't see any of the images past through the lattice work. So, you know, where have they gone?
So people, do we lose touch with them?
It's going to be unknown.
It's like there, St. Louis might have been like the first wave, there's a greatness of the people that one person is a smaller line there, and then there was New York, and then at this particular time, which the way to progression.
Yeah. I think it's sort of the amount of interpretation that we can make with this image, and this is true in all of Lawrence's panels, his visual language is so loaded with meaning and symbol that you can really interpret it very, very broadly and far beyond just the individual caption. It gives sort of a great depth of possibilities of interpretation. And with some of those interpretations, you could compare the ratio of when people migrated to St. Louis, sort of the trajectory of the Great Migration, and get a sense of interpretation if it wasn't borne out by Lawrence's work. These are great ways for students to engage with the work and sort of explore some of these questions. Now,